It's an international stereotype that us Brits love to talk about, the weather. But in fairness, the weather has been making more headlines, not just in the United Kingdom, but across the globe. And with every storm that hits our shores, it seems the country is simply not equipped to deal with it. The roads and railways have been known to descend into chaos. Homes and livelihoods are lost to flood waters. Millions lose power. Schools are closed. And so it's perhaps no surprise that there are growing calls for the government to do more to bolster our infrastructure and help us better weather the weather. Let's take a look at just some of the most recent devastation and disruption here in the UK and elsewhere with our correspondent, Alex Barker.
It's become an all too familiar sight. Roads becoming rivers, fields becoming lakes. The government estimates 6 million homes and businesses in the UK are at risk of flooding, and thousands have been damaged in the past year. The government has spent millions on clean-up and repairs, and last month's storm Bert alone is estimated to cost hundreds of millions of pounds in insurance claims. And it's a story being told worldwide. More than 200 people lost their lives in devastating floods in Spain last month, and the financial cost is over 10 billion euros. Central Europe, including Romania and Germany, were hit by severe flooding in September. This was Bolivia last month, and this past year, virtually every continent has witnessed similar pictures. And people are turning to their politicians for help, with world leaders donning their wellies to visit scenes like this. There have been record numbers of flood alerts in Britain this year, and with each devastating storm, people are starting to ask why places aren't more prepared for this kind of weather. It's not just rain and flooding either. In the UK, snow closes roads and railways, as does extreme heat or trees brought down by strong winds. And power was lost to over 1 million homes earlier this month during Storm Dara. Yet in countries like Canada or Switzerland, the railways cope just fine in the snow. Trains run through deserts in temperatures over 40 degrees Celsius. So are there lessons the UK can learn from other nations to bolster our own infrastructure? The government is spending billions on new flood defences, and following Storm Bert, the Environment Secretary Steve Reed promised weather resilience will be a priority.
Climate change will inevitably lead to more severe weather. As Secretary of State for the Environment, I have made it my priority to improve our flood defences and drainage systems to keep people and businesses safe.
Despite those words, there are growing calls from the public and indeed MPs for the government to do even more.
Residents need practical support quickly, and they also need some reassurance for the future.
The need for improvements in our flood defences is absolutely urgent and critical.
Businesses still continue to flood.
Community resilience for severe weather incidents should be a statutory duty.
So many seem to agree that we do still need more research, investment and action to better protect our lives, homes, businesses, land and transport from the forces of nature.
Joining me now is environmental campaigner Louis Ramirez and chief political correspondent for The Times, Aubrey Allegretti. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. This is for both of you. Aubrey, let me start with you. Do you think, having been around most of the headlines for many years, that the UK is well prepared for storms?
Well, it would seem not, and the government has sought to do more over the last few years by investing money to protect against things like coastal erosion, because it knows just how bad the pictures are that broadcasters run of people talking about their lives and their livelihoods destroyed. But of course, politicians have to bear in mind the trade-off between spending money on something that is an immediate concern and spending money early in order to prevent a concern arising. And that's where really governments come unstuck, because they don't want to necessarily put all the money that there could possibly be needed into these things to prevent them happening in the first place.
Now, Louis, you have been around many parts of the country looking at areas which have also been affected, and you've spoken at events on these things. In your opinion, do you think the UK is well prepared for storms?
Look, my opinion is one thing, but I think that if you take it from the perspective of the people, in Wales and in the West Midlands who have had their homes invaded by mud, or worse, right, once again, because it's been repeat hit communities, who then go to work in the middle of a cost of living crisis, they come back to a home that's basically uninhabitable, then they have to go through an immensely bureaucratic process, insurance claims, and then when they go to government, they're frustrated because of a variety of reasons. And one of them is that the system for supporting them is incredibly complex. A second one is that it's incredibly bureaucratic to navigate the insurance for those who have it, and the grants and the systems after. And then finally, I think, and this is one of the main points that is leading to frustration, is that they're also struggling to get any honest answers from governments, whether in Wales or England, because fundamentally the problem with the policy to handle these storms is that there isn't a vision or a plan for what it is that we're trying to achieve in the first place.
The government would say, wouldn't they, Aubrey, that actually, and in fact, I think I've got a quote here from the current Environment Secretary, Steve Reed. The government inherited, as ever, from the previous government flood defences that are in the worst condition on record. Now, he says, we've allocated in the budget £2.4 billion to upgrade our flood defences.
That's the last government's policy, though.
Well, now that's interesting. It is the last government's policy, isn't it? They haven't really done anything new. But is £2.4 billion actually enough to spend on flood defences, do you think?
Well, it's a start, but I mean, the real issue is not necessarily with the quantity of money, but how it is being spent and where it is being spent. And actually, if you look, for example, at the National Audit Office into the sort of flood resilience report that came out last year, what they were saying is that there is no evidence that that money is being sort of matched up correctly with risk assessments in local authorities. And so how the money is being spent is actually part of the problem, as well as how much.
But look, 2.4 billion to most people is a huge amount of money. It's where it's been spent, Aubrey's saying. Now, you seem to be suggesting, Louis, that it's a complex organisation of responsibility, that, this money is probably not going to get to the right places.
Look,
is that true?
Again, it depends what you're trying to achieve, right?
Well, presumably to protect us from being flooded.
Yes, absolutely. But right now, UK government policy, so this has devolved, but no UK government policy aims to protect everyone, right? That is considered too expensive. Nor is there a standard of what we define as safety. So £2 billion, Steve Reed might say this is the Conservatives' capital scheme over the 6 years that's being continued under this budget. And what we haven't heard from Steve Reed, and I think a lot of flooded people in this country are desperate to hear, is a commitment to not just continue, but then expand those particular schemes. And so until there is a vision for what it is that we're trying to achieve, how many people we should protect, what happens to those people that are not getting protected, I think everyone deserves safety from their government in their homes, in the same way that we have safety from burglars, from crime, from fire. But
hang on, you said the government can't try and save everyone from this.
No, I said the government says it can't try to save everyone.
But you think they should?
Look, I think that on some level, there's always going to be trade-offs in public policy, of course. But there are examples of countries that have always had existential flooding problems, which is what we may well be heading into. And one of the things they do, and if we look at the Dutch example in this case, which was considered too expensive by DEFRA, is they said, right, everyone is entitled to this basic level of safety. Now, this kind of comes back to this idea about resilience, which is, from the standpoint of flooded people right now, what the policy in line, even with these 1 billion, is de facto austerity for all of the people who are not going to get proper protection. There is a tendency internationally and very alive in the UK to try and pass off the costs of disaster management, of disaster recovery, from government to the individual.
Well, Aubrey, what's wrong with that? I mean, at the end of the day, you've got property. Well, you've got property owners owning their own houses, aren't they? And yet appealing to the general taxpayer to say, look, we bought in an area, there's a risk to flooding, it's getting worse, protect us. Why should they pick up the bill?
Well, I think that is an interesting point, because there are obviously not just a sort of set of parameters.
Politically courageous, though, wouldn't it?
It would be, although it requires a government that wants to be politically courageous about that.
It's already what's going on, though, in many parts of the country.
Well, okay. How is that presenting itself? Because people are doing insurance, people are taking responsibility for that, but you're talking about a local community, a local area, a local authority. If they've got problems with rivers, why are they not sorting out and paying for it locally?
Well, there's a couple of things going on here, but I'll give you an example, right? So I was in Shrewsbury last, I think it was late February, after Storm Henk, in a public meeting. How does this present to itself? The government saying, right, this is actually on you. Well, it presents itself in a maddening set of kind of vague slogans that are thrown at people by the Environment Agency and other authorities saying, well, oh, we can't build our way out of this, when really what it's saying is, we have decided it's not affordable and it's down to the individual. Now, to the previous point you were making around, okay, so what's wrong with the homeowner paying for this? Well, there might be a bit of give and take here, but fundamentally, we have a flood problem in this country. The risk is rising, and someone is going to have to pay for that, right? It's going to be the individual, or the taxpayer, or industry profiting from this, or industry that is creating the risk, right? The risk is being driven up overwhelmingly by the climate crisis, and second, by runaway real estate development, as well as faulty government policy. And the debate that flooded people are owed, I would argue, is around, okay, so who is the fair character to fund a proper flood risk management national strategy in this case? And I would argue, and this is where the environmental campaigner in me comes in, which is that if the risk is being driven up by burning fossil fuels, then much like the insurance industry pays into resilience, we need to look at expanding the source of levies. We already have resilience levies, and expand the range of stakeholders that are paying into this to make it affordable.
The thing is, Aubrey, politically, governments have to make choices with the money that they've got. Isn't the reality here that unless you have been affected by a flood and live near an area, or worse, been through what is a horrible experience, there's no real votes in pumping lots of money into flood defences, are there?
Well, I think it slightly depends on the constituency. We saw at the last election that in certain areas, environmental issues were really high up voters' priority list. And we're not just talking about sort of big global issues like climate change, but local issues like the quality of their local river or seawater. And so actually I think this could potentially be a threat. Labour has to decide how brave it wants to be in standing up to these people and saying we don't have the adequate resources or money to do this right now, in our view, making a political view, as you said, or whether it wants to recognise the realities that this is something that, you know, will affect a growing number of people and, you know, should go beyond which people are going to vote for them, for example.
But isn't it ultimately going to be a binary choice? If I said to someone, do you want to cut your waiting list quicker or put money into flood defences, whilst they might want to ask both, they're not allowed to answer both.
But that's not the choice though, is it?
Well, it is for a politician when they decide how much they can spend.
Again, I mean, there's this... So I would kind of reject this idea that the people out there whose homes have been flooded 4 out of the last 5 years and are now just up to here and near despair are, in asking for adequate protection, trying to kind of jump the line in front of your mother who needs a cancer treatment or something like that. And yes, at the same time, there's public expenditure. But first off, flood risk management policy is not just about funding. It's also about regulations that are not being implemented right now, such as regulations on new builds. Secondly, again, within the flood risk management system, we have levies right now that are paid for this. So flood funding comes from a central pot.
Who's paying these levies?
Right now, it's local governments, but it shouldn't be. And what I think flooded people want is a decent level of safety that fairly reflects the
contributions. Who should pay them?
I think that fossil fuel companies who are driving up the risk should make a contribution. I think real estate companies should be making a contribution, or at least not adding to the current.
What about the
level.
homeowners who are building on floodplains and buying a house on a floodplain?
So the homeowner's not building on a floodplain.
Well, they're buying a house on a floodplain and the full knowledge of what they're doing.
They don't always have the full knowledge of that as well. So we do need, look, that there is this kind of argument that keeps coming back around, well, you knew it's your fault, right? Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. At the very least, we need to ensure extremely well-applied regulation on full disclosure of risk for people buying new builds. And then to come back to this point as well about the politics of this, look, what I would argue is that there is a national disincentive not to invest, because the next time there's a major event, you don't want to be the government that cut the funding, because then you will bear the wrath of this. And the problem with this is that UK flood risk management policy is fundamentally reactive. We wait for a disaster to happen, then people care, Then we throw money at this.
Aubrey, I mean, answer me this, because, you know, we can get very much into the detail of this, but to most people in the street, they think it's bonkers that we're building houses on floodplains. Why do you think that is not being challenged? Is it because of the tension between the need currently to build 1.5 million houses a year and we'll build them anywhere?
It is a difficult balancing act, and the government has to show a certain amount of braveness in standing up to both water companies and telling them to sort of pay their fair share and take their sort of responsibility for things like drainage systems, and also house building and development firms as well. We know that houses are continuing to be built on floodplains. Sometimes people go into that situation with the knowledge of where they're buying a house and the risk involved. Sometimes they don't, and lots of people, of course, live in areas where flooding has presented a more recent challenge, and they already owned property either residentially or for business purposes, and they've seen their insurance costs shoot through the roof. So I think those are the sort of tensions the government's trying to navigate, not upsetting the water companies and the house builders too much.
But there's two things to explore there. I mean, one of them is around this idea of we keep coming back to the idea of the responsible individual, but a very significant number of the properties that flood in England aren't in areas that have been designated as at risk, right? First off, I think that's around 20%. Then there's this issue around insurance, which is that, so you buy a home that's been built after 2009. That home is not covered by something called flood re, which is what keeps homes from becoming uninsurable in this country. And so within these kinds of contexts, if that home floods, then it might very well become uninsurable. But we're also focusing on a narrow set of phenomena, and we've got an uninsurability crisis potentially going to happen when this scheme flood re expires. But what we also have, which isn't being discussed, is thousands of kilometers of English coastline in areas that are now already under existing climate scenarios going to be at massive risk of flooding and locked in already.
Okay,
we
so
don't have a plan for those.
You see things getting worse, and we'll try and touch on the plan. I want to stick to the insurance for a minute at the moment, because in 2023, the Association of British Insurers reported that the UK paid out something like 300 million in flood-related insurance claims. And that was part of total weather claims of nearly 600 million. Huge rise. There's going to be more rises. The economics don't sound like it's sustainable. Do you think the government's response will be less strategic and maybe just impose a cap so that insurance is capped like it is in countries like Florida?
This particular government wants to be seen to be on the side of consumers, and so I think they will want to ensure that people can continue to claim as much as possible. So until there is more of a sort of crisis in the industry, I think we'll continue to see the system as it is.
I mean, Louis is absolutely spot on when he says that we have government by reaction. Are we looking at a scenario where we will see, for example, something along the scenes that were horrific in Valencia, killed a large number of people, alert systems failed? Is it going to take something of that magnitude for politicians perhaps to deliver the plan that Louis is keen to see?
I think it's optimistic even to think that a catastrophe would be the sort of silver bullet that would then pave the way to all of the reforms and changes that we've been discussing. We've seen extreme heat at the other end of the spectrum, houses catching on fire in suburbs in South London during the extreme heat wave of a few years ago, and yet everyone says sort of lessons must be learned, and we need things to happen faster. We can't wait for climate change to sort of catch up with us. But actually I think the reality is that governments do move slowly. They have things that are higher up the priority list. We know about other emergencies that are affecting this government, like the prisons overcrowding crisis. So it's not as though the government's only capable of sort of dealing with one pressing issue or emergency at a time. But I think even in the scenario where there is a sort of catastrophic event, that will encourage people to sort of sit up and take notice and bring it more national attention outside of the times of year that we normally talk about these issues.
So yes and no on this. I mean, historically, UK flood risk management policy response to the last disaster.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Louis. You actually put your faith in government even more perhaps than expecting individuals to do it. Do you still have faith in government?
Do flooded people have faith in government? Increasingly not. That is a toxic situation to have, because where else do they turn to? And once they feel abandoned, and they do, then increasingly they get susceptible to burn the system down messaging. And so it's not so much, do I have faith in government? I read the same media that we all do. There's a lot of very difficult issues in this country. State capacity is down. I think the right question is, what else is there, right? What else is there when your home is flooding 5, 6 times in 7 years, and you have no hope that anyone's going to come out and make it better, and the thing keeping it insurable, if it's insurable at all, expires in 16 years, and to this point, what's the government going to do? It's going to do nothing, and it'll get negotiated down to the wire to avoid a massive kind of crisis and devaluation of homes.
Okay.
What else is there?
Let me move this on for the last remaining few minutes we have, because we've been talking a lot about flooding. This is something I'm sure I think it'd be fair to describe you as a commuter. All right. Why is it in this country, though, when we look at our wider infrastructure, a storm can come along, trees litter the railway lines, we're not able to get our trains moving. And yet, if you look around other parts of the world, you know, in extreme weather conditions, people are able to move around. Infrastructure still works. Is that a failure of government just to accept, you know, there's going to be a few weeks a year when nothing's going to work?
It is almost sort of commonly accepted in this country, isn't it, that the slightest bit of snow will mean that transport grinds to a halt. You know, often the phrase "leaves on the line" gets mocked by people that don't understand how this can sort of cripple an entire transport system. But there is an issue to do with how much flooding impacts other parts of our infrastructure. It doesn't just affect businesses and homes. It affects hospitals, it affects transport hubs, rail stations, places that are used in order to provide help, support and emergency assistance to those who are in need. So, you know, it is completely true to say that this is a much wider issue that doesn't just affect people in directly flooded communities, but also the response, the ability for people to come in and help and respond as well.
Louis, if you had one ask, you had a magic wand, and that one ask was of government, what would you actually ask them to prioritise?
Within flood risk management?
Yeah.
Look, I would say that we need to be proactive and not reactive. We know that climate change is biting. We know that climate change is making these storms happen more regularly. We know that climate change is being caused by fossil fuel combustion, and we know that this is going to get worse. And so the ideal way for government to deal with this at this point would be to get ahead of this issue and start planning for it right now. And
does that mean a change of policy, or do they need to toughen up their policies?
Absolutely.
Do they have a policy, Louis?
Well, they have a policy of increasingly trying to offset the cost of flooding to the individual rather than government in the name of resilience. But what they don't have is a plan, and that was in the National Audit Report that you've cited, as well as the ABI.
Do they have targets? How many homes should be safe in this country from flooding, and we will achieve it by the year 2029?
Well, that's the kind of target we need, or at the very least, here is the baseline level that anyone can expect, so that then when you go to a community that's already hurting really badly, psychologically wounded from flooding, it can at least have a yardstick against which it can decide whether or not that was a policy failure. We don't have that. Right now we have targets, so per capital scheme we say, right, 300,000 homes better protected. Again, National Audit Office. It's nice because it gives us a number, but it actually tells us very little. What does better protected mean in this particular case? So it needs to set a target of, okay, what does a resilient nation look like given the scenarios and a massive amount of uncertainty happening around the climate crisis? And it needs to have a proper democratic discussion about how we are going to collectively cope with that.
If I may. Last question for you, Aubrey, is that Louis is making a very direct link with the climate crisis here. Now, the government do that as well, and they impose levies on the consumer. They change their behaviour, telling them what cars not to buy, what cars to buy, taxes here and taxes there.
And on flooded people as well.
Are we actually going to get to the point where we will have this amount of energy spent on flood protection and require the consumer, at a cost of living crisis or not, to pay more? Do you think that's where it's going to head?
Possibly, although the government seems slightly reticent to move further, or faster rather, than it thinks that most people are sort of financially willing to be compliant with that. We saw the last government sort of get burnt by this, and we can argue about whether or not they were right or wrong, but they certainly feared that prospect, and that caused them to put the brakes on it. It seems as though this government is not sort of going to sort of go full gung ho.
We saw in a by-election, a famous by-election in Uxbridge, that the voters actually rejected sort of green taxes and things like that. Do you think that would be the same outcome here?
Well, that was one extrapolation.
This government is taxing North Sea oil and gas production to fund climate mitigation. It is doing that. That is a popular policy. And there's no reason not to do that to also fund adaptation, or in this case, flood protection. These policies are popular, so it also really depends.
Well, I should challenge you on how you know they're popular, because I've not seen the data. So I'm sure we'll come to that on another occasion, Louis.
All the time by
for no other reason.
NGOs,
You've got the last word there, but you won't get one if you keep going on at the moment. It's been a real pleasure to have you here, an expert on this subject. And Aubrey, thank you very much for giving us the political dimension. Thanks again to my guests for joining me, and don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.